Well, are you ready for some gutsy women? I think I know a couple who are ready for you too, so give me 1 second though. First, on behalf of the entire staff at Politics and Prose, and especially our extraordinary events team led by Liz Hoddle, we would like to thank President LeBlanc and all our friends and partners and all of the students at GW who are here with us tonight. As President LeBlanc mentioned, I'm Lissa Muscatine. I'm co-owner of Politics and Prose, and I'll be moderating the conversation with our very special guests, Chelsea Clinton and Hillary Rodham Clinton. We're here to talk about their new book, hot off the presses this week. It's called The Book of Gutsy Women, Favorite Stories of Courage and Resilience. I've been asked to remind all of you that you will get your copies at the end of this event. If you go downstairs, you will have a copy waiting for you. So don't forget to pick them up. By way of explanation, I just wanted to mention that I first met Hillary and Chelsea Clinton more than 25 years ago in 1993. Chelsea was 13 years old. And let's just say that it was quickly apparent that she was the most eloquent, poised, and smartest teenager in the history of teenagers. Nothing she's done since has surprised anyone who has watched her grow into the remarkable woman that she is today. She's an advocate here and around the world for women and girls, a promoter of civic dialogue and public engagement, and a powerful voice for saving our planet from existential threats like climate change. She's an assistant professor at Columbia University's School of Public Health, and of course, she's already a prolific author. She's co-written a book on global health and 6 children's books of her own, as President LeBlanc mentioned, all testaments to her profound commitment to diversity, inclusion, human rights, and social justice. Her good work on behalf of so many people in so many places is informed and inspired in no small measure by her role as the mother of 3 small children, Charlotte, Aiden, and the very, very recently arrived Jasper. She's also been inspired by the woman who will be on stage with her tonight, her co-author of the Book of Gutsy Women. Speaking of whom, is there a gutsier woman than Hillary Rodham Clinton? She's the trailblazing, transformational First Lady of the United States, a 2-term U.S. Senator from New York, a Secretary of State, a global champion for women and girls, human rights, and democracy, and the first woman ever to be the nominee of a major political party for President of the United States. Now, I just have to offer a quick reminder about that 2016 presidential election. Because no one should ever, ever, ever forget that Hillary Clinton won nearly 66 million votes in that race. And let's just not forget either that that was 3 million votes more than the man currently occupying the White House. And to be clear, she won nearly 66 million votes, even with a certain Russian dictator putting his thumb on the scales to help her opponent. So by my calculation, that means that today, 3 years later, at least, and I mean at least 66 million Americans are certain that the White House would be in much better shape right now if a woman, her, were running the place. You know, and isn't it amazing that Donald Trump just can't get over it? He just can't get over it. But I digress. Hillary Clinton is here tonight wearing a different hat, that of in her role as author. Like Chelsea, she's written 6 previous books, including major bestsellers. And I have a sneaking feeling, and when you see the book, you'll understand why I'm saying this, that for her, this latest book may be the most special of all. Please join me in welcoming mother and daughter, co-authors of the Book of Gutsy Women, Hillary Rodham Clinton and Chelsea Clinton. Hi.
Great to be back here at GW, and I want to thank President LeBlanc for welcoming all of us. Our family loves coming here, and we were just talking backstage that both my husband and Chelsea, as well as myself, have been here numerous times on this stage, Bill and I speaking, Chelsea dancing when she was in the Washington Ballet. So
I don't know why you all just laughed. I mean, I was never a star, to put it mildly, but I wasn't bad.
But it's just great being here, and always great to be with you, Lissa.
Well, thank you. I feel like we've done this now.
Yes.
We've done it in various combinations, and it's always fun, and it's such an honor for me. And first, I just want to thank you on behalf of womankind for this book. I was saying to them ahead of time that the frustration tonight is going to be that we can only talk about so many of them, not nearly the range that we would want to. Otherwise, we would, and we could, right? We could stay for a week and talk about all of them. Yes. It's an amazing book. It's so important to have the stories of so many women in one place. And we'll talk about that in a second. So we should get going because we don't have a ton of time and we want to cover as much ground as possible. But I want to start by saying, you wrote this book together. In journalism lingo, we would say you have a joint byline. So how did you decide whose name went first?
Gee, we didn't even really talk about that. No, age before beauty, obviously.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
but the process of having a joint byline, of writing a book or anything with someone else, is incredibly rich because of the different experiences and points of view that your co-author brings to the project. And for Chelsea and me, it was especially exciting because this book comes out of a conversation we've had literally since she was a little girl, talking about people, especially women, who inspired us.
Yeah, no, and that's what's so great about it is the stories are so deeply personal to each of you in some cases and to both of you in some cases, and across cultures and generations and geographies and backgrounds. And so, there's really, it's an extraordinary range that you've put together. Now, just one other kind of superficial question, sorry, but Chelsea, you have mentioned with a huge amount of affection and a tad of exasperation what it has been like to co-author a book with someone who still writes in longhand on yellow legal pads. Well, maybe not yellow, but anyway, on legal pads. So I'm just wondering if there were any other challenges working with your, archaic mother that you would care to share with, there are many students here, so I'm sure they would relate, that you want to share with us. Maybe not.
Well, thankfully, her penmanship is legible.
Yes, this is true.
So I did.
Unlike your father's.
Unlike my father's.
Yeah.
And listen, I knew that my mother wrote in longhand because I had seen her writing process for what happened most recently in her previous books. I hadn't, though, understood what that would be like for our working dynamic. And that not only does she kind of write longhand, she edits like pen on paper too. I thought surely she would have at least come to understand why track changes are our friend or comment boxes. And yet she hadn't. And despite all of my efforts to persuade her that this would really help us work together and we could see our different thought processes and we could go back and forth in the document, I knew there was no way I was going to get her to do a shared Google Doc. I thought at least track changes. She does know how to use a computer. But no, it just wasn't comfortable for her.
Okay, all right. Now, really, in my defense, you know who else writes longhand for his books? Barack Obama. So I rest my case.
Okay. Well, he may be a dinosaur also. Okay, I'm gonna turn the tables a little bit, so you're gonna get your chance, because I'm sure there are many women in the room like me and you who have daughters whom we love deeply and transcendently. But mothers and daughters trying to write a book together conjures, at least I think for some people, images of a lot of screeching and door slamming. So were there any surprises for you working with your daughter?
And, we started by making lists, and honestly, the lists were in the many hundreds of athletes we admired, entertainers we admired, business leaders, academics, public servants. I mean, we had many hundreds of names, and we began to try to narrow it down. And the only, back and forth that we had in the beginning was I would advocate for the people I wanted to remain on the list. She would do the same. We would try to compromise. Sometimes I would say, no, I have to have her in. And Chelsea would say, no, I have to have her in. And so we ended up writing more than 200 essays. And our publisher rightly said...
Volume 2.
Yeah, well, our publisher rightly said, that people have to carry, the book around on a scooter or something, because, so we cut dramatically, and that was hard. We had lots of really challenging conversations about who was going to be cut. Sometimes the editor would make suggestions, or I would, or Chelsea would, and then one of us would say, no, I don't want her cut. So that was the only real problem that we had, and we ended up with a very representative group of historic figures, fictional figures, contemporary figures that really did capture what we were trying to convey, because at the end of the day, we are so grateful for these women and their lives, and we wanted them to be seen as whole people. They're not perfect. They're not, up on a mountain somewhere. They worked hard. They overcame obstacles. They're gutsy because they made it clear that they were following their dream, that they had a mission in their lives, and it wasn't easy. And so we think that those stories are good ones for us to share because we find them so inspirational.
Can I just follow up on that a little bit? Because one of the things that is interesting is the sort of span that you cover. And you talk a little bit, each of you, about the differences growing up, the sorts of role models. You had very few. You had your mom, you had your sixth grade teacher, Mrs. King, I think that was her name. You had Amelia Earhart, you had Jo in Little Women and Nancy Drew. And Chelsea, you had more. You had a pediatrician who was a woman. You had a mayor of Little Rock and you had a few more, not huge numbers, but at least a few more women figures who were brought up in your classes in school. But I wonder how that sort of generational difference, how each of your experiences as women experiencing changing gender roles influenced these selections. Chelsea?
I don't think I had quite understood the juxtaposition between kind of my mom's growing up and my growing up with regards to kind of women role models until we really started this effort. And my mom just reflected how the only women she knew who worked outside the home were her school teachers and the public librarians. Mm-hmm. And that was just so different than my growing up. The vast majority of my friends' moms worked outside the homes. Some who were lawyers like my mom, some who were nurses, doctors, entrepreneurs. As you mentioned, like when I was in kind of first grade, our mayor was Lottie Shackelford, a woman. Betty Lowe was my incredible pediatrician who took great care of me and kind of later went on to lead the Children's Hospital. And so I just had all of these really visible, kind of dynamic and inspiring women who were in my life. And I also thankfully had teachers really all throughout school who were determined that not only history, but also social studies and science and math were not seen as just the province of like old straight white men. And so I'm so thankful to my teachers who kind of, introduced me to kind of, Grace Hopper or Elizabeth Peratrovich, these kind of amazing women who then I write about kind of in Gutsy Women, and I may never have known about them but for my teachers. So I just had such a different experience.
It's so interesting that you really weren't that aware till this process of that. Does that surprise you at all?
When we began talking about it, we both realized what a gap there was, because, in my case, there were women that I read about in books or in the pages of Life magazine. I include several of them because as a child, Life magazine was one of the doorways to the world. So that's where I read about Amelia Earhart, or I read about Margaret Burke White, or the amazing Margaret Chase Smith, the Republican senator from Maine who stood up against her own party and took on Joe McCarthy. And wouldn't we like to see that again? And so part of it...
That was one of my later questions.
That's how I met these women. There wasn't very much in my elementary and junior high school years, probably, as I recall, not even much in high school years, that talked about women. I mean, maybe, you study ancient Egypt, Cleopatra might be mentioned, but Hatshepsut would not be mentioned. And so part of it was just coming to grips with how hungry I was and how encouraging my own mother was for me to pursue these women and learn more about them. But it wasn't part of my schooling at that point in history. In fact, there's a funny story in the book because I came across Helen Keller because of a television dramatization of her life. And this amazing woman who was taught by Anne Sullivan to communicate. Fast forward, last year, the Texas State Board of Education decided to eliminate Helen Keller and me from the curriculum. And I was really upset about Helen Keller being eliminated. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, and apparently we're both in, although I hope she has a lot more prominence than that, because she deserved it. So, and then I talk about how I go to the library, the public library. I went every week with my mom, or when I got old enough, rode my bike. And the librarian, that was taking care of kids, she said, "You've got to read this new book. It's about this young girl named Anne Frank." I mean, I didn't know anything about the Holocaust or about what happened. I was probably, 10 years old. So that was how I discovered these women. And as Chelsea and I were talking about it, it was a very different experience between the two of us.
Well, let's talk for a second about this definition of gutsy, which you touched on a second ago, and you do talk about it in the book in different places. And I was really struck, you should all know, and you'll see when you get your copies, that they divide these women into these groups: educational pioneers, storytellers, athletes, advocates, and activists, elected leaders, healers, explorers, and inventors. And that's not all of the categories. And within each of those categories are women who worked inside the system, women who worked outside the system, women who were loud, women who weren't loud, women who pushed for change, women who were part of change. And some of these women you could have cross-categorized, right? You could have cross-referenced them. And I just want to mention another way I've thought about some of the women in the book is they're pioneers. They're women who were breaking barriers, like Virginia Johnson, the great dancer, was such a big influence on Chelsea. Mathematicians, astronomers, and scientists like Ada Lovelace. You mentioned Grace Hopper, even a mountain climber who I'd never heard of, Junko Tabe. Problem solvers, women like Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, who you may not recognize the name, but she's the doctor who fought to clean up the water in Flint, Michigan. Flossie Wong-Stahl, you write about, Chelsea, who helped develop cutting-edge gene therapies to treat HIV and hepatitis. And then persisters and resistors, suffragettes, Billie Jean King, community and labor rights organizer Ai-jen Poo. Mana al-Sharif, who you may remember, is the woman in Saudi Arabia who's fought for women to have the right to drive. And one of my favorites in this book, Dr. Hawa Abdi, who has risked life, limb, and everything. really against incredible odds to open and sustain health clinics for tens of thousands of displaced people in Somalia, and the list goes on and on and on. So what is the common denominator of gutsiness in all these women? How did you each define it? How did you, what were there metrics you had to apply to whittle that giant list down to the 103 women in this book?
Well, some of the whittling down really had to also just be kind of the visceral reactions that we each had, kind of when we thought about not including them. Yeah. But for us, really, Lissa, gutsiness, is so evident in all of these women's lives because they were not only kind of driven by their own purpose and to lead their kind of own life that they felt called to do, but they were determined to make the world a better place. And sometimes the world was defined as their family or their school, their community, and sometimes really as our kind of global community. And so all of the characteristics that you mentioned, particularly persistence, which I feel kind of very keenly is one of kind of the core competencies for any life well lived, are just kind of embedded in the gutsiness that these women demonstrated and continue to demonstrate. Because changing the status quo wasn't just for themselves, it was kind of for everyone.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a key factor, because truly there are so many people, so many women we admire. But as we were narrowing the list down, we were looking for what it was about that woman's life, her work, her advocacy, her mission that affected others. And it became, once we started talking about it, a key ingredient, as Chelsea said. And I am someone who has been privileged to meet some of the women, as has Chelsea. And so when you meet someone like Dr. Hawa Abdi, this very modest-looking woman who stood up against Al-Shabaab, the Islamist terrorist group in Somalia, when she had opened up her farm to shelter 90,000 people, predominantly women and children, who had sought refuge there, and they showed up and demanded that basically she turn it over to them, and she stood her ground and refused and basically, confronted them by shaming them. What are you young men doing? Why are you even here? Why are you fighting? You meet her, and she's the most unimposing person, but the story of that confrontation and her continuing support for all of these women, now supported by her two of her daughters, who are also physicians, that just stuck with me. And I have so many stories, personal stories. I met Dr. Hawa Abdi through Vital Voices, which is a great organization that highlights women like her around the world. And part of what I wanted to do was to introduce our readers to more of these women, because everybody gets a little discouraged and a little down about whatever happens in your own life, or certainly whatever happens in our larger society. And I just want people to remember historic figures who were willing to take those risks and stand up and fight back and speak out, and women today, like Dr. Mona from Flint, who is the one who said, wait a minute, something's wrong with these children I take care of. I'm a pediatrician, there's something wrong. And she would not quit talking about it, even though people were trying to dismiss her. So that's the characteristic of, just determination, persistence, on behalf of others, not just on behalf of themselves.
Well, you both talk about persistence. You've just mentioned it now, and I think I read in the book, or I've heard you say, and Chelsea, I suspect this is part of a required ingredient of persistence, is optimism. That even in the face of incredible challenges that many, many of these women have faced, they somehow remain optimistic.
Yes, I think, if they didn't believe that their kind of energies kind of married to their talents couldn't make a difference, they would not have persisted. And I think that is such a powerful example of what it means to be optimistic. in the world. And just kind of, listening to my mom, I was thinking about kind of arguably the largest group of women that we write about, the vaccinators.
Yes,
The largely kind of women workforce, millions of women who kind of every day work to inoculate children against everything from measles and polio to the courageous frontline vaccine workers in the DRC who are desperately trying to vaccinate everyone against Ebola. And hundreds of lives have been lost, just in the last 6 years. And yet, kind of more and more people continue to rise up and do that work because they know how important it is kind of to public health, but also to the optimism of their own communities to give every child an equal shot at life, which is what I would think anyone would and should want. And yet we know in our own country that is, not always the case.
We got a lot of questions from the audience. I'm going to periodically chime in with one of them. Now is one. I think this is directed toward you. When you're not feeling your most confident or bold, what do you do to feel gutsy? And this is from Alex E., who says parenthetically, P.S. I love you.
I think about you, Alex, wherever you are.
I think we heard Alex somewhere. There was a...
I want to be a little serious about this because part of the impetus for the book was when Chelsea was writing her wonderful children's books. She persisted, and she'd go out and do book signings and meet so many little kids who would come with their parents. Or when I was out doing my book signings, both before the 2016 campaign and then afterwards with my book, What Happened, so many young kids would say, who are your heroes? I mean, who do you look up to? And I found that such a poignant question because it's easy to be torn down in today's world. I mean, we all have our flaws. We all have clay feet. We're all far from perfect. So who are the people that you can look up to and that you can be inspired by? So I spend time, when I'm a little down or discouraged about the state of the world, I do spend time thinking about some of the people, both women and men, and young people who have inspired me. We have two groups of women in this book who have taken on the scourge of gun violence. And we are so moved by Sarah Brady, whose husband was shot when President Reagan was confronted by an attempted assassination and was paralyzed. And Sarah never expected to be an advocate against all of the gun violence that we see, but she became one. Or Lucy McBath, whose son was murdered, and now she's in Congress. And our dear friend Gabby Giffords, who survived an assassination attempt and kept going. And someone like Nelba Marquez Green, whose little girl, Anna Grace, was murdered at Sandy Hook. When I think about people who face those kinds of just unspeakable, unimaginable tragedies, it gets me going again. It gets me up. And Chelsea, you might want to talk about the young women, because one of them is here with us.
Julia Spohr is here. She just celebrated her 18th birthday. You can give Julia a round of applause. We write about Julia and Nazari and Emma Gonzalez and Edna Chavez and Jasmine Wildcat and these incredible young women who are standing up against the NRA, but also standing for kind of more research and sensible gun violence prevention legislation, awareness about the crisis, tragically including in young people of death by suicide, kind of with a gun frequently. And so just to echo kind of my mom, I think, how could we then not do everything that we could do? If Congresswoman Lucy McBath can get up every day and kind of work to ensure that no parent confronts what she did when her son Jordan was murdered, how could we not honor that every day? Or Sabrina Fulton, who's now running. If you want to contribute, this will be the only kind of super political thing I say, maybe. But if you kind of want to contribute to a campaign today, please consider contributing to the campaign of Sabrina Fulton, who is Trayvon Martin's mother. She is running for Miami-Dade commissioner. So, what right do we have to pity or to ever feel like we should not be doing everything we can possibly doing if these extraordinary, courageous, heroic women can find it in themselves to fight for a different future that was robbed from their children. So.
And, Sabrina Fulton wrote a fabulous book a few years ago with Trayvon's father. It is so worth reading. It's really excellent and good for her, right? And which brings me to another audience question. Chelsea, I'm going to give it to you. You've watched your mother enter the world of politics and all that has come with that, all the incoming that has come with that. And the question is, what would you recommend to a young girl wanting to be in office? You've just mentioned a number of women who catapulted themselves into office or are running for office because of personal tragedies or events that weren't being addressed by the body of Congress and their local governments. What would you tell a young girl? You've written about also encouraging kids to get involved, becoming engaged, learning how to advocate.
Well, one, thank you for thinking about it at this moment in time. I know there is kind of this belief that young people and maybe not so young people kind of look at what's happening in the world writ large and become kind of overwhelmed by it, or kind of look at what kind of anyone who kind of steps into the arena has to endure, like online and offline, and kind of this belief that maybe like people are going to stop running for office. And yet, thankfully, we've had unprecedented numbers of people running for office, and not only running kind of for kind of Congress, but also running for county commissioner or city council, the state legislature. And so I would just hope, like, if this is something you feel called to do, like, think about what you want to change. Because if you're really interested in criminal justice reform, like, run for state legislature, right? The vast majority of people incarcerated in our country are sitting in state prisons or local jails or really unaccountable, like, sheriff jails. So think about, oh yeah, thank you for the people who responded to that. So think about, like, what you want to change and how best to equip yourself to be competent and qualified to help make that change, and then run for office.
And there are a lot of groups to help too. I have an organization called Onward Together, and we support groups of young, political activists who are recruiting candidates, like Run for Something, which has done an amazing job recruiting thousands and thousands of people to run for all kinds of offices, or Emerge America, that focuses its energy on women running for office, or Color of Change, or the Collective PAC, or Voto Latino, and all these groups that we support, because when you make the decision, hey, I'd like to do this, you need to learn what that means and how best to go about it. And these groups, there's a bunch of them out there now, can give a lot of good support and even training to people who not only run, but want to be part of campaigns.
Mm-hmm. I want to, in a second, come back to young people, because I have a question about what they teach us. But first, you all see this book cover up here. The photo is fascinating. And because you talk a lot about the importance of women's stories, the fact that women too often go unnamed, unnoticed, unappreciated, unrecognized. And I think this photo kind of explains why you wrote the book. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the photo, which, by the way, has been reprinted all over the place, is well known to many people, very familiar, and yet...
So for a long time, for decades really, This photo was believed to have been a snapshot after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And yet, thanks to a librarian in Hawaii named, shout out to librarians. This is great, it's so interactive. Named Dorothea Buckingham, she wanted to know more about this photograph, this iconic photograph of her home state. And so she kind of dug in, and she realized that while it is from 1941, it's actually from the summer of 1941, and it's a training exercise of the kind of women at Pearl Harbor who comprised the majority of the firefighting crew. And she was determined to identify kind of who the women are. And she was only able to identify 4 of the 5. But we now know their names, Catherine, Alice, Elizabeth, and Hilda. So we don't know the 5th woman's name, but thanks to Dorothea Buckingham, she not only kind of corrected the history of the photograph and what the photograph captured, but she also was able to kind of give a name to these gutsy women who were practicing and who later we know were called to help after the attack.
There's also an interesting story that this photograph represents, because when I was growing up, basically I was taught that there were no women firefighters. I never saw any. And yet this was 1941, and these women are in a training exercise because they're firefighters. So I do want people to really understand that we go in cycles. You know, there were millions and millions of women in the workforce during World War II. They had to be. They were in factories, they were in offices, they were doing work that supported the war effort, that kept the economy going. And that was something that affected the lives of, I would guess, more than half of the American families in our country. After the war, it was thought, well, okay, we need to get back to the way it was before, so we need to, give these jobs back to the men coming home, and women need to go back home and go back into the family. And so these kinds of cycles, and one of the cycles that was finally broken, we write about, was the passage of Title IX, the legislation that made it possible, not just in athletics, but in academics, for women to have the same rights to study and to pursue sports that young men did. And just think about this. Before Title IX, and the 3 women who were the real godmothers of it are in the book, 2 members of Congress, Edith Green and Patsy Mink, and an academic, Bernice Sandler. So before Title IX, there were 700 women in the United States in school who played soccer. Now there are nearly 400,000, over 390,000. And it was, when we were writing this, we were really motivated because of the World Cup team, because those women all benefited from Title IX. And not only did they, but stars on other nations' teams had come to the United States to play intercollegiate soccer at our universities, and they too were benefiting. So, there are rhythms to all of this. And part of the motivation for writing this book is to make sure that we don't go backwards, that we don't have rights ripped away from girls and women, that we don't have both overt and hidden discrimination, once again, standing in the way of young women succeeding. I did a book signing last night at Barnes & Noble in Union Square with Chelsea, and we had 1,000 people. We had to cut it off at 1,000, and people were telling us their stories as they came through. And I had 2 different women who said, boy, I'm in, both of them said, I'm in finance in the city, and it's just so rough. It's so hard, and it seems to be even harder now. Mm-hmm. So part of this is to kind of buck everybody up and say, no, we're not going back, and we're not going to give up, and we're not going to allow, the Handmaid's Tale to, take root here.
You read the Testaments? Have you read?
No, but I also think for those of us who weren't alive when Title IX was passed, and I think generally think of it as affecting sports, it is important also to understand the broader effect it had on academics and on research. And one of the women we write about is Vera Rubin, who is largely considered by people in her field to be kind of one of the Nobel Prize's just inexplicable misses, because she really helped kind of solidify the proof around dark matter, which is the majority of our universe, and that's about all that I understand about dark matter. But when Vera Rubin graduated from college, she really wanted to go to the kind of physics PhD program at Princeton. And they said they didn't accept women. And it wouldn't change for decades. In fact, it didn't change until 1975. And so I say that because I think sometimes we believe we've come so much further than we have, and that kind of we've made more progress kind of over a longer time horizon than actually kind of is reflected in the historical record. And yet, of course, like if you kind of look at the statistic my mom mentioned for soccer, like we have made so much progress. I just think it's hugely important that we never mistake progress for success.
Can I just say one quick thing too about Title IX, because I benefited it in a way that you didn't. I was right starting college when it passed. I got to play varsity sports in college, which you would not have had. And there's not that big of an age difference between us, and yet...
Yeah, but there's a big talent difference.
Well, there certainly was a big opportunity difference. But I just want to remind all of you that Title IX didn't just pass and everything was hunky-dory. I mean, it had to be fought to be enforced on so many campuses for decades afterward. And, it's still, there was the big argument, well, if we give these, let these women play sports, that means, the guys can't play football or wrestling or whatever. And it was just this assumption that it wasn't right to men to let women, quote, take their slots or whatever. So it was a long, ongoing battle just to get it enforced. And we shouldn't forget that, because it really was hard. These young women, they're amazing. I was going to mention the gun activists by name. You mentioned most of them. You mentioned Anne Frank. Just the number of young women who have led movements and spoken truth to power. Little Ruby Bridges Hall and her little backpack going to integrate her school when she's 6 years old, and Malala Yousafzai, who I'm sure many of you know about, who was shot just trying to go to school, shot in the head, and of course now Greta Thunberg, who's basically single-handedly launched an entire environmental movement.
I always feel like I have to talk about Claudette Colvin.
Yes.
Thank you. Because I think she's a huge part of our American history, and her story is not sufficiently kind of well known. She stayed seated on her bus 9 months before Rosa Parks did. Mm-hmm. And I write about this in the book, while we justly respect and revere Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin was one of the plaintiffs in Browder v. Gale, which is the district court ruling that ultimately was upheld by the Supreme Court that ruled bus segregation illegal in Montgomery and in Alabama. And she was 15 years old, and she just said she felt like she had Harriet Tubman on one shoulder and Sojourner Truth in the other. And she just couldn't stand up that day and give up her seat to the white lady who was demanding it. So when we talk about young people, we have to remember her because she really deserves to be remembered.
And I want to say a further word about Greta Thunberg, because when she started her school strike for the climate, she was the only person who showed up and for weeks she would do it, and then slowly other people would join her, and it became, a global mass movement, as we have seen over the last few weeks. But here's what I wanted to emphasize. In addition to her being a determined, passionate advocate for us doing what we know we should do with respect to the climate, she also has autism.
Yeah.
And she has persevered. She has persevered with her very strong faith that one person can make a difference and one person can spark others to join. And she has, as often happens when you stick your head out, especially if you're a young person, she has engendered wild support and millions of young people wanting to be part of her campaign. But she's also engendered an enormous amount of blowback. And she's been criticized and marginalized and made fun of, how she speaks, how she presents herself, how she looks. Everything about her is being, undermined by her critics, who are really, I think, doing so because they recognize the power of her example and the spark that she has lit across the world among young people. And I think that's another part of this book, which bears underscoring. Oftentimes, when you take a stand, in Claudette Colvin's case, she went to jail. She got arrested. She was, in a very difficult position legally. Or Greta Thunberg, she's being, everybody from Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin has criticized her, which shows you she is really on the right track. And
Badge of honor.
Right?
Yeah, so these young people, to me, what they're telling us and teaching us is that you have to have a willingness to be defiant, right? You have to be willing to be defiant. And that can look, it can take different forms, right? So, Chelsea, you talk about Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who's this rabble-rousing nun who's like breaking shine all over the place in the 17th century. And you mentioned Margaret Chase Smith, and I was going to raise her. You said, I sort of wonder what would happen if she were in the Senate today. And I was going to ask you that, and not entirely facetiously, but here's why. Today is the 1-year anniversary. Everybody know what it's the 1-year anniversary of? The confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. And that, as we all know and painfully remember, came after these wrenching hearings in which Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who no one had ever heard of before, which is like a research scientist, came forward, and then we know that a certain other later Republican woman senator from Maine basically determined in part the outcome of that whole debate and process. And the world sort of divided into two camps, those who believed Dr. Blasey Ford and those who didn't. Now, I'm raising this because I think it reminds us of this other sad reality, which is so much of what your book is about, which is that, and it's not just about the challenges that women face in telling stories of sexual assault and abuse, though those are certainly, a part of it, but just the narratives of their experiences and their lives that just don't have validity, right, historically. And so you have somebody like, a nun in the 17th century who's challenging that and trying to get this right. And she's taking huge chances and she's rocking the boat to do it. And it's because history is written by men. It's the story written by men, and it's about men. And until we create a foundational history that really truly includes and values the stories and experiences of women, the history is incomplete, which is one of the reasons you are writing this book. And I was really taken, Chelsea, by one of your examples, which is Rigoberta Menchú. I don't know if I pronounced it right. She wrote a memoir about being an Indian rights activist in Guatemala in 1983. You say it was the first memoir you ever read. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992 for fighting genocide against indigenous people in her country during Civil War. But questions were raised about the authenticity of her story. And, you know, she was sort of subjected, and you know something about this, to a very hostile counter-narrative of who she authentically was. And yet here she is in your book, and I'm so interested in your including her.
Well, as I said earlier, like, I'm so grateful, and I think I feel this way now, particularly as a parent, for the really extraordinary teachers that I was lucky enough to have. I think I read I Rigoberta with Mrs. Linhoff in 5th grade. So shout out to Mrs. Linhoff at Booker Arts Magnet School in Little Rock, Arkansas, for believing that it was important that we understood what was happening around the world, and also like what the United States' role kind of was in that. And so I read this book when I was 10 or 11, and I just was so kind of struck in a way that I think now kind of we have the language to talk about how privileged I was in ways that I hadn't even understood. And then when she won the Nobel Peace Prize, and then in the controversy that ensued when she was just, attacked for kind of making personal things that clearly were personal to her, even if she hadn't witnessed them herself, and understanding kind of the tradition of testimonial and kind of the authenticity of her kind of narrative, even if it kind of wasn't up to whatever standard largely men and kind of white European men were holding her to, and just her kind of grace and grit and kind of consistent articulation, like, of what really was her truth, and the truth that she was fighting for her Indigenous community, that she still is fighting for. I mean, she and her foundation are literally right now trying to hold accountable, like, the provocateurs and the kind of executioners of the genocide, like, in Spanish court. So the fact that she kind of withstood this just personal demeaning and derision, and just refused to be bowed by it, like, went back to Guatemala, ran for office multiple times, supported kind of other Indigenous candidates, and still now is fighting for justice, I find incredibly inspiring. And in some ways, even more inspiring than I did when I first kind of read her book more than 25 years ago, because of all that she has endured, and because she just continues so heroically to persist. And I think it's so clear that she just couldn't imagine doing anything else.
Yeah, I think that you're right, Lissa, that the stories need to be told. And a lot of times the stories are not just about an individual, but about a larger social reality. And I think that is an important point that Chelsea wanted to make in writing about Rigoberta, but I think it's also true for a lot of the women in this book. And you mentioned Margaret Chase Smith. If you go back and read her statement of conscience, there's a great story which we put into the book. So she's in the Senate, and the fact is that Joseph McCarthy is ruining lives and smearing people, and nobody is saying anything. And he is getting away with it largely. And she just has had enough. She just cannot tolerate it anymore. She's no flamethrower. She's no rebel. She's a person of conscience. And so
very conventional.
Yeah, but she writes about how she's on the subway that I know very well from having been in the Senate, the subway you take from the office buildings to the floor of the Senate, to the Capitol. And McCarthy's on the subway, and he looks at her and he goes, "Oh, you seem so serious. Are you going to go make a speech?" And she goes, "Yes, and you're not going to like it." And so she goes, and she not only calls him out, but she calls out the Republican Party for failing to rein him in, to prevent his behavior. And
where is she today?
It was a very lonely position for several years, because he wasn't finally held to account until really President Eisenhower and others, basically made it clear that it had gone too far. and I think that a lot of the people that we profile in the book had moments like that. And part of the reason we choose the ones that we do is because they rose to that moment. So Billie Jean King interviewed us at our first event in Brooklyn a few nights ago. And I watched Billie Jean King. I played, tennis when I was a kid, and I watched her, and she was just so ferocious. And I also, though, really appreciated how she stood up for other tennis players.
She compromised a lot of her own success by staying up all night trying to figure out how to get equal pay for women.
That's exactly right.
She would have won a lot more titles had she not been fighting for the whole shebang.
And she has no regrets because, she has a great picture of her meeting Venus and Serena Williams, who are also in the book, when they were little girls. And so she was somebody who had this incredible talent married to this fierce competitive spirit that she used on behalf of others and made statements by what she did and what she said. So I think that those are the people that we need to hear more from and that we need to be honoring and supporting. And it's not easy. We know that. We see it all the time. But it's necessary. And history will look kindly on people who are willing to be out there on behalf of others.
Certainly hope so. I want to give you this one more audience question. There's like a kind of 800-pound gorilla in the room that we haven't touched on yet. Secretary Clinton, thank you for coming to speak at GW. We know that President Trump has recently welcomed openly some of the most authoritarian regimes like China, Ukraine, to investigate his political opponents. What message do you want to send to the American people to restore America's democratic leadership around the globe?
Well, I have been encouraged that at least the polling and public opinion suggests that the issue that started with his call to the Ukrainian president has broken through in a way that many of his other actions have not, in terms of the threat that they pose to our democracy and to our Constitution. I was on the impeachment staff that investigated Richard Nixon back in 1974. And it was an incredibly solemn and serious, deliberative effort, as it must be, because basically the founders decided that elections had to be held and people had to be judged at the ballot box, but there could be office holders who, in between elections, were engaged in such behavior that was damaging to the system of government, through abuse of power, through obstruction of justice, through contempt of Congress, that impeachment was this rare but necessary remedy. So I supported Speaker Pelosi when she finally decided that you could not walk away from the evidence that was provided first by a whistleblower, but then confirmed by the White House itself, about what Trump had been trying to extort from the Ukrainian president. Now, think about this, because when you have a president calling on foreign adversaries for assistance in his political campaigns, which he did in 2016, and which he is doing again, that goes right to the heart of our sovereignty as a nation, to our national security, in a way that is almost unimaginable. I cannot imagine any other president ever even thinking about this. So here we are, and the evidence only becomes more compelling about what he and his close associates, including the Secretary of State, were up to in trying to maneuver this new young president of Ukraine into doing his political work. And then, of course, yesterday, the president said that he wished China would also investigate the Bidens. Now, I joked about that some months ago on Rachel Maddow. I said, you know, in the 2016 election, Trump basically said, Russia, if you're listening, you will be richly rewarded if you can find Hillary Clinton's emails. And it was all out in the open. And of course, we know the Russians hacked the DNC, hacked my campaign, et cetera. So now it's also in the open. We'd like to help defend your country against Russian aggressiveness, but first we have a favor to ask of you, which is please go after Joe Biden and his son. There's another sideshow to this, which is help us try to undermine the Mueller report and all of the evidence from our intelligence agencies that the Russians interfered in the election. Because, you know, Trump knows he's an illegitimate president who got illegitimate foreign help. And so we know what he did in Ukraine, and it was so alarming that it wasn't just the whistleblower. Remember this, the whistleblower did come forward, but clearly people in the room listening to Trump's end of the conversation, or maybe listening to the conversation, which often happens in the White House because you want to have a good record and figure out, you know, what the president said and what the other leader said. People listening were so alarmed that they immediately hid the transcript of the call from anyone who has any reason to be working on behalf of Ukraine in the Defense Department or the State Department or any of our intel agencies. And they put it, they tried to hide it in a server that is supposed to hold only the most highly classified secrets of our country. So we know that the Ukraine investigation is proceeding, and the very first witness, a distinguished ambassador, Ambassador Volker, provided a lot of evidence that at the moment, in contemporaneous time, diplomats, like Ambassador Bill Taylor was saying, you know, it's crazy to be basically withholding military aid to get help on your political campaign. Now, it is crazy unless you're also doing Vladimir Putin's bidding. So there's another dimension to this that is potentially going to be uncovered. So then he asked China, well, look, we have several adversaries, about 4, that are highly adept at cyber warfare. Russia, obviously, China, if they were so inclined, North Korea, and Iran. So what happened today? Microsoft reports that Iran is attacking at least one Democratic campaign. All bets are off. If foreign governments think they can tilt the playing field, as they did against me, which was a deliberate, well-planned effort laid out in indictments against Russian military actors and their allies, well, you know, the Republicans seem to think that, okay, so far Russia's playing on the red team, and, you know, so we like it. We're not going to stand up against it. Well, who's to say that next week they're going to be playing on the blue team? It's crazy, my friends. So impeachment is the appropriate remedy, and it is such a serious assault on our democracy that is apparently asked for, aided, and abetted by not only the president, but his allies, who seem not to either care or understand how deeply dangerous this is, that I am all in favor of what the House is doing and gathering the evidence and making the case, because this president has to be held to account because of his unconstitutional abuse of power, his contempt of Congress, and his obstruction of justice.
I'm just going to ask you one question about this.
And you know, I want to just add one more point. One of the people profiled in the book is Barbara Jordan. And if you did not know of Barbara Jordan, or maybe hadn't heard of her recently, you can read what we write about her in the book, but go back and read what she said as a first-term member of Congress sitting on the Judiciary Committee during the Nixon impeachment as to why she wanted to not only defend the Constitution, but make very clear that if the Constitution in the remedy of impeachment did not cover the behavior that was being presented to the committee, then what did it mean? And go back, you can also go, you can Google her, you can watch her, you can listen to it, and you can watch her make one of the most powerful speeches in the 20th century.
Okay, so we're getting toward the end, not there yet, but I because there's so much awfulness that this man has inflicted on us, you've just described some of it. But one of the really, I think, most troubling and upsetting things about him is this just sort of blatant misogyny and sexism. And, anybody who's been around you and worked for you since you've been in the sort of national consciousness has watched the degree to which you have been on the end of misogynistic, hateful, violent imagery and language. And it's really upsetting. And I was thinking about that because so many women in this book have been subjected to incredible gender-based violence. I mean, it's not that far of a stretch to go from language that talks about, doing horrible things to you to doing horrible things. And there are a lot of women in this book who've had really horrible things. Diana Nyad, the swimmer who was abused by her trusted coach for many years. Wangari Maathai, who led the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, environmental justice activist and democracy activist, beaten. Ineth Bedoya Lima, who's a brave journalist who worked to expose corruption and drug cartels in Colombia, was raped, tortured, left for dead by the side of the road. I was with you in, I think it was 2009, in the Democratic Republic of Congo when we visited Dr. Denis Mukwege, who spends his life repairing women's bodies, women who've been subjected to rape as a tactic of war. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize with a woman that you feature in the book, Nadia Murad, who many of you may have heard of, a Yazidi woman who was forced into sexual slavery by ISIS, now works with the UN to combat gender-based violence. And this is really awful, and it's getting worse under this president and with the kind of culture he's perpetuating of hostility and anger and vitriol towards women. And I guess I just, I don't really know how to assess all of it. What do we make of these stories, these examples? And do women have to be continually victimized and brutalized before we actually pay attention to their stories and understand what they're subjected to and the injustices? I mean, what is it going to take to get beyond this? It's so rampant.
Sorry, that was an inopportune time to drink a lot of water. Well, Lisa, I think, the answer is multivariable, right? I mean, we know we need more robust laws. We know we need more robust enforcement of those laws. We know we need more kind of resources to support women who have been brutalized, victimized, subjected to horrific violence. We know we need to not be cutting down the number of people who can qualify for asylum in our country, so that we can be a safe harbor for anyone fleeing violence, but particularly women. And I do think there is an important part kind of to this work here in the United States that we don't talk enough about and that I am deeply passionate about. And someone you didn't mention kind of in your list of women who have survived horrific things and are working to ensure that others don't suffer similar horrors is a woman named Frady Rice, who is the founder of something called Unchained at Last. And she is tirelessly working to ensure that no child is ever married here in the United States. And the reason I raise this is because I do think we send a pretty powerful signal for how we value the dignity and the kind of bodily autonomy and the kind of general self-determination of girls if we allow them to be married at 12, 13, or 14. And there are still lots of places here in the United States where girls can be married at 12, 13, or 14. And we've had more than 200,000 girls married, just in this new millennium, like just since 2000. And so I think, it's not only what often seems obvious, Lissa, that we have to tackle, but we have to raise the marriage age and ensure there are no exceptions so that no girl is ever a bride in our country. So it's the things I think that we do talk a lot about around human trafficking, around ensuring that we're investing more in supporting kind of services to ensure that women get out of dangerous situations and can recover, and everything that must entail. But it's also things that often aren't embedded in this conversation but really need to be, like the work to end child marriage, which is a huge problem here still in 2019.
I also want to underscore the importance of women who obtain leadership positions, because there are examples in our book of women who became elected leaders and did not forget where they came from. So here in our country, Shirley Chisholm, who became a member of Congress and the first African-American woman elected to Congress, and was just, as she would say, unbossed, fearless in standing up for the poor and the needy, for women. She said when she ran for president that, the criticism and the attacks that she got were more for being a woman than for being black. And she never, ever let anybody forget that. Geraldine Ferraro, who became the vice presidential nominee and was a staunch advocate for women's rights and a really great voice in the political debate. Abroad, the two women presidents who we highlight are Michelle Bachelet, who was elected twice to be president in Chile, and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was elected twice to be president in Liberia. Both of them were subjected to torture and beatings and caught up in the conflicts in their countries. In Michelle's case, because of the Pinochet dictatorship, her father was tortured and died in prison. She and her mother were rounded up and tortured and then deported. And she never, ever forgot what happened and was determined to not only bring a more peaceful transition and future to her country, but also to stand up for young people, for women. And the same with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, caught up in the Civil War in Liberia and, arrested and jailed. And, you just think about how they persevered, to get back to that word persistence. And then when they became the highest official in their respective countries, they spoke out on behalf of, women and girls and changed laws that would try to provide more support. And of course, Lemo Gawe, who was the Nobel Prize winner, along with Ellen, for helping to end the Liberian Civil War, is such a hero because of what she did to organize women to stand up against the warlords. And if you've not seen the documentary, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, it's really worth looking at. So I really think that you're right, that you can get all kinds of abuse, physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, and I know that it's hard to keep going through that, and it's not any kind of judgment when somebody just wants to totally drop out and retreat and not be putting their head out there again to be one more time attacked. But these women who kept going back and kept standing up, whether they sought office or they kept writing stories or they were advocates for change in their societies, including our own, are ones whose, courage is so inspiring. It goes back to the question that Alex asked me, some time earlier here. You read about, you meet, you follow women who did that, like Chelsea talking about Frady. She was forced into a marriage, a religiously mandated marriage at a young age, physically abused by her husband. When she finally left him, she also had to leave her community because it was not accepted. And then she took what happened to her and turned it into this movement, and she's going state by state. So when she started, there were 50 states that still allowed child marriage, usually with the quote, a permission of the parents, but oftentimes that's not particularly to be relied upon. So now 2 states have raised the age of marriage, and she's just determined she's going to do everything she can to make that happen. So I think these stories are not just about the past; they should be reminders and prods for us in the present and thinking about the kind of future we want.
So I'm going to get in trouble because we're out of time, but I have one last question, and then I just want to end after the question, but can you answer it quickly?
Maybe I'll try.
So it's a great question. It's for you, and it's from Jana, and she said, "What's the most valuable lesson you've learned from Chelsea?"
Well, I actually have learned a lot of lessons from Chelsea. Even from the time she was a little girl, she was just so ignited by injustice. If she ever saw people being mean to somebody, or she read about, we tell a story because Chelsea was a huge Sound of Music fan, and we talk about Maria von Trapp. And when Chelsea was 5 years old and heard that President Reagan was going to go visit a cemetery in Germany that where a lot of where a lot of Nazis were buried, she was really upset because she'd seen The Sound of Music and Nazis were not nice people. And so she wrote a letter to President Reagan asking him please not to go to the cemetery because anybody who'd seen Sound of Music should know that they should not. So her spirit is so strong in standing up against the slings and arrows. And I personally love following her on Twitter because she gives the best shade to all of the haters that are out there.
Well, I want to tell the second part quickly because I know we are out of time, of the story about my letter to President Reagan, in which I included a whole sheet of rainbow and heart stickers as a gesture of goodwill. And he still went to Bitburg and later tried to justify it by saying he was only there for 8.5 minutes. And I thought, any second was too much for the American president to effectively be paying homage to fallen Nazi soldiers, particularly because it included SS leadership. But I never got a letter back. And I was really quite disappointed by that. I'd written the president, he should have written me back. And he at least should have said thank you for the rainbow and heart stickers. But when my dad won in 1992, my parents said, what do you hope could happen out of this experience? Is there anything you want about when we moved to Washington? And I said, I want every kid to get a response if they ever write to the president or the first lady or the White House. And so my mom, as First Lady, created the White House children's unit within the correspondence office. And at least, I don't know if this still happens, but at least kind of through the Obama administration, there was an effort to track kids' letters to ensure that especially kids got a response from the president. So I'm just so grateful to my mom for doing that.
I want to say that your spirit is contagious. Your spirit is contagious. I want to end with a quote that you have in the book from Gloria Steinem, and she says, "I'm not giving up my torch. I'm using it to light others." And I want to thank you both for keeping your own torches lit, for lighting torches for so many others, as you do every day in the work that you do, and now in these incredible stories of women that we can all share, across everything, across the world, across generations. And thank you both so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you, DW.